Hi, this is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Today, one of the things on my mind is just war theory and religion and Judaism, and specifically, is there a just war theory in Judaism? And also, does Judaism have anything to say about the conduct of war? And I thought there's really nobody better I could talk to about this than somebody who has both a military background and is a rabbi. And so it's with that, it is my honor to have on today my friend and neighbor, Phil Lieberman. Phil, want to introduce yourself? Tell me who you are.
Thanks so much for this opportunity, Michael.
My pleasure.
As Michael said, I am a medieval Jewish and Islamic historian. So, I'm a faculty member at Vanderbilt University in the Department of Jewish Studies, as well as in the law school, where I teach Jewish law, Islamic law, and a little bit about law and religion. But as of last year, 2023, I went on active duty orders because I am in the Navy Reserve. I serve as a chaplain. And I'm on active duty orders teaching at the United States Naval Academy in the Department of History, where I teach midshipmen a little bit about the survey of pre-modern history from ancient times up until 1750. And I have the opportunity to teach a little bit about Jewish and Islamic history as well.
I should add before I forget, Phil's also the co-translator of this amazing thing that just got published. There is a link in the description. It is a translation of the Guide to the Perplexed, which is one of the heaviest books of medieval
Works, as
Jewish.
we say, the Naval Academy is a boat anchor,
This
correct?
works as a boat anchor or even a sea anchor if you manage to drag it off, toss it off your ship. Uh, and it is one of the most important works by a guy named Moses Maimonides, whom I believe, Phil, you're going to be talking about
For
uh,
sure. We'll talk
in
about
this. Yes, we
Maimonides.
can talk about it. So why don't we just open up then the general question, like, is there such a thing as a Jewish just war theory?
Right. So many ethicists, when they talk about just war theory, begin with medieval Christian notions of, jus in bello, jus ad bellum, and so on and so forth. Like,
Mhm.
what exactly is just war? But you can go back to the Hebrew Bible itself for a discussion of what kind of wars should be pursued by ancient Israelite society because ancient Israelite society did defend itself. Ancient Israel had bone to pick with several of its neighbors. And so later readers of the Bible are going to systematize the ideas about war in the Bible itself into what we might think of as a kind of proto just war theory. In particular, one reader, whom you just mentioned, Moses Maimonides, who's born in Spain in the 12th century. Spain in the 12th century, by the way, is very interesting, and I hope we'll get the chance to talk about it. It's a place where there is a lot of religious conflict between Muslims and Jews, Muslims and Christians, and so on and so forth. And out of that environment, Maimonides, who systematizes much of Jewish law, also does provide a kind of systematization of the theory of war, from which we might kind of identify a Jewish just war theory going back to the 12th century, about the same time that ethicists will say they can find just war theory in Christian Europe as well.
So is there a clear one in the Bible though, like before Maimonides, or are we really
So
just sort of waiting
the,
for Maimonides to come in and explain it to us?
the right. So again, I think what Maimonides is doing is partially explaining what the Bible is doing and systematizing it like he always does, because the Bible is such a complex collection of materials, right? The
Mhm.
Bible has narrative materials, it's got genealogy, it's got legal materials, poetry, right? And so to take that material and kind of systematize it and structure it around sort of theoretical ideas like what just war is, the Bible's not interested in doing that, but there's a ton of narrative about war in the Bible. And there is a ton of narrative about ancient Israel, engaging its, its neighbors in battle, engaging its enemies in battle, and then how you deal with captives, how you deal with booty, how you deal with caring for the land in the wake of conflict, and all of those are elements of just war theory. So, the Bible's interest isn't in giving you a kind of systematized theory, but we can derive from biblical narrative and biblical law some of those ideas.
So let's get into it then. So Maimonides swoops in and he systematizes what's already in the Bible. What does he
Right.
do with it?
Right. So first, I mean, he has to systematize the fact that in a few places in the Bible, for instance, in the book of First Samuel, the Israelites engage their neighbors, the Amalekites, in
Mhm,
battle, and God says to their king, to King Saul, who is primarily there to bring together the 12 tribes, to create a united kingdom, and to allow them to establish a kind of regional empire. And that empire will exist through the reign of King Saul and his two successors, King David, right, famously, and then King Solomon, right. After King Solomon dies, this kind of empire breaks apart into the north and into the south. But under King Saul, we have the first king who has unified the tribes together. And so Saul engages the Amalekites, and God explains, Israelites, when you were wandering in the desert, right, the Amalekites took advantage of you. The stragglers, the weak among you, were kind of picked at by the Amalekites. The Amalekites engendered a sort of environment of terror. And so, Saul, when you engage the Amalekites, you have to destroy them completely. Not only the combatants, you have to destroy the men, the women, the children, and the animals.
mhm.
Now, Saul, for whatever reason, it seems is pressured by his people, the Israelites, who say, listen, this booty is valuable. You shouldn't destroy this. And so Saul actually, leaves aside some of the booty and actually doesn't even kill Agag, the king of the Amalekites, right? Imprisons him and so on. And God gets wind of this. His prophet comes to King Saul and says, what are you doing, leaving aside some of the booty? Why, when I asked you, says God, to destroy everything, did you not follow my instructions? Saul says, listen, I did follow God's instructions. And so then the prophet Samuel says, really? What is that mad that I hear? Right. So he knows he can hear the animals in the background. So it's a kind of a piece of biblical, humor, if you will, or irony, right? And then so Saul admits that he really was setting it aside, but he set it aside for God, right? So again, Samuel doesn't believe this and says, "Listen, Saul, you didn't follow God's command, and God is going to tear the kingship from you." And in a very emotional scene, King Saul reaches for Samuel as he's walking away and grabs his cloak, and the cloak rips. And Samuel turns around and said, just as you have torn this cloak, so too God has torn the kingship from you. And then the king Agag of the Amalekites is cut down um, by Samuel himself, right, by the prophet, and a pretty powerful scene. And that's sort of the end of that conflict with the Amalekites, who are understood as a people forever at the tail of the Israelites, forever taking advantage of the weak. And so when centuries later, the figure Haman in the book of Esther is explained to be a descendant of King Agag. We know from the first lines of the book that he is a bad man. He is the ultimate enemy of the Israelites. So, on the one hand, Maimonides, writing in the 12th century, has to negotiate the fact that the Bible has this sort of, absolute intolerance for certain enemies,
Mhm.
right? With an understanding that there are certain types of battle that aren't engaged in with that sort of comprehensive destruction of the enemy, and are not even what we would call an obligatory war, a defensive war to protect the boundaries of ancient Israel, but are what, as Maimonides systematizes it, would be called a kind of a voluntary war, a war of expansion.
Okay, so according to Maimonides, then there are two different kinds of wars, right? Both of
Correct.
which are legitimate.
I mean,
Or
well, listen, for starters, right? The obligatory war is the war that, is a defensive war to
Mhm.
protect the bounds of the land. The war of expansion can only be, and this is an innovation of Maimonides, can only be sort of undertaken with the approval of a kind of a grand court. Okay. And this is a little bit of innovation on his part that he says it needs to be with the full approval of, if you will, the ancient Congress, right? So imagine, right,
Mhm.
that, in American life, right, we haven't had a war declared by Congress since World War II. We've had a lot of conflict, right? We continue to have conflict, and we might even call them wars. But from the perspective of American law, they're not wars, right? So too, Maimonides imagines this other type of war, the so-called milchemet reshut, or the optional war, perhaps a war of expansion, and that has to get the approval for Maimonides of the Sanhedrin, of all the judges in Israel, a court of like 70 judges.
So he doesn't call it a war of expansion. He calls it an
No,
optional war.
milchemet reshut, an optional war, exactly.
Okay. Which might be a war of expansion.
I mean, this is the category, right? As opposed to the so-called milchemet mitzvah, or the obligatory war,
Mhm.
right? A defensive war. The milchemet reshut is a discretionary war, a war of expansion,
Okay.
right? And we might say, right, that preemptive strike against an enemy is a discretionary war, as opposed to, right, a response. And this, of course, in the life of the contemporary state of Israel, right, this is the key question about the Six-Day War, right? The June 67 war. Was this a preemptive war, a preemptive strike against Israel's neighbors? Or was Egypt closing the Straits of Tiran, right? Was that the opening volley in the battle? And that has real consequences in how the, sort of final status of areas that were conquered in that war, play out.
How so?
Because in our day and age, we don't think that wars of expansion are permissible, right? The
Right.
national boundaries fall where the national boundaries fall, right? And so when Iraq goes into Kuwait in 1991, right? Then America is going to respond and say, hey, Saddam Hussein, you violated sovereign boundaries, right?
Mhm.
Whereas if Israel was simply responding to to an aggressive action on the part of Egypt, throwing the first punch, as it were, then maybe those territories that were conquered were just a consequence of a war that, Israel was simply defending itself.
Because it's ultimately about the purpose, like the end, the reason why you're conquering the land.
Well,
Is
right.
it,
So the question
are you
is
doing it
again,
to conquer it, or you're doing it because you're in the midst of an effort to defend yourself, and along the way you happen to get this land?
right, right. I mean, listen, you're a parent of boys, so
Mhm.
who throws the first punch, right?
Right, right. Which isn't necessarily the same thing as who's actually to blame. I mean, I've noticed with the kids.
Exactly right,
Right,
right.
right,
But as
right.
a parent, right, you might say, right, you're not going to say, all right, who teased the other person?
Right.
How did we
Did
get here?
did
Right,
you have it coming? Right? Did
right,
you
exactly.
deserve
Did you have it
this?
come? Right, exactly. No, it's something that the easy way to think about it is who threw the first punch. Now, I always say to my students at the Naval Academy that we have to take a more complicated, a more nuanced understanding of international affairs and understand that as Clausewitz says, right, war is just politics by another name.
Hmm.
So there are plenty of ways that one country can throw the first punch and war can be on without, any bullets flying,
Right.
right? Whether it's right economic, whether it's intelligence, whether it's diplomatic, right? There are plenty, and I would argue even, and this is kind of underweighted, I would say, by strategists, the culture war, right? That countries can be in a kind of Kulturkampf without even sort of throwing a punch, but that's a real struggle, a real battle going on between them, just across a different domain.
Right. Absolutely. I can tell you've been around the military because you're using a word like domain. That's very important.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's also another spiritual domain. I think that's very important. And You've got a halachic domain that's also
Right. No,
for
I mean
war
that's
fighting.
right. So I mean there is the kind of narrowly legal domain of of pursuing war. And
Hmm.
again, this carries beyond what we think of when we think about war. For instance, you're not allowed to chop down the trees in the area that you take over, right?
Hmm.
And so, the environmentalist in us would say, that's about, preserving the land, but it's also an understanding that you might have a conflict with another people, but that doesn't extend to to the land itself, right? Trees are not human beings. They are, not supposed to be victims of
So
the
does that
conflict.
suggest that there are limits? I mean, so that's one of the things that I try to understand. I mean, there's sometimes certainly in the Bible when there's this absolute like exterminate them all, like the
Right.
Amalekites, right? But others not so much. So there
Right. There
seems to
is
be this
the
gradation.
Exactly. There is the, obligatory war versus the discretionary war, right? And so the obligatory war is the Amalekites. And, it is not, every war that you might get into, and even every defensive war,
Mhm.
right? The Amalekites are kind of exceptional because, again, like Saul does battle with them, conquers them, but he's told to destroy everything. That is
Right.
different. Yeah.
So does that mean that everybody was right to freak out when Netanyahu drew some
Parallels
connection?
with it. Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
parallels
right.
with
But
Amalekites.
right, what he was doing was drawing on a well-known biblical trope in order
Hmm.
to vindicate, that conflict. Sure. And so, by the way, it's worthwhile pointing out that, Israel is a Jewish state, but what it really is a Jewish state, right? That
Right,
is to
right.
say, right, Israel doesn't fall under Jewish law, right? Maimonides' code, the Mishnah Torah, right, his kind of restructuring of law, biblical and rabbinic, right? The rabbinic guides, right, from the close of the Bible onward, sometimes capturing very ancient ideas, but sometimes like a real sea change from what the Bible has itself, right? Over the first, let's say, 500 years of the Common Era, right? And then Maimonides, like 600 years later, totally restructures Jewish law in his code, the Mishnah Torah, right? Neither rabbinic law in the Talmud, nor Maimonides' code, nor later codes, particularly the Shulchan Aruch from the 16th century, the sort of foundation stone of contemporary Jewish religious life, right,
Hmm.
is the law of, nor has it ever been the law of a
Right.
state, right? The modern nation state just doesn't function that way.
Is there at all in Maimonides a at all a kind of a dialogue? I mean, there's obviously dialogue going on between him and Muslim philosophers,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
this is purely that, like to a large extent,
With
but
philosophy, yes,
with
but
philosophy. But when it
yeah,
comes to whatever Islamic just war theory is, and that's a subject I
yeah, yeah,
know
yeah,
absolutely nothing about, but is there any kind of dialogue? I
yeah.
know it's like most of it is about the Neoplatonism and right,
No,
but
no, no. But listen, Maimonides grows up, as you said, born in Cordoba in
mm,
1138, right? Shortly thereafter, okay, Cordoba is taken over by a wave of tribes from North Africa called the Almohads. Okay. Now, the way that most historians of the last generation saw the Almohads, the term actually Almohad, you can hear the word wahad in there in Hebrew,
mhm,
echad, right, meaning one. So the Almohads were Unitarian, monotheists, whatever. They were seen by scholars as extremists, came up from North Africa. The 14th century Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun describes waves of tribes coming up from that hard scrabble environment in North Africa and then taking over Spain. And as they move into Spain, right, which is much greener and wealthier, then they become wealthy and then they become decadent and then they sort of give up on their traditional background. And then a new wave from that hard scrabble environment comes up. So in a little bit after Maimonides is born, Cordoba is taken over by these folks called the Almohads. And, I think that coming up in that environment, which his family quickly leaves. Shortly after Maimonides is born, they head south, and then eventually they leave the Iberian Peninsula. They head for Morocco, which actually is kind of the hotbed of the Almohads for a little bit, and then eventually the land of Israel, and then Maimonides lives out his days in Egypt as the leader of the community there. But I think that his code of law, the Mishnah Torah, is affected by the Almohad environment. Like when he talks about about war, he says that one of the things that you're supposed to do in pursuing those wars is root out unbelief, right? Just as in the Guide to the Perplexed, he says the purpose of the commandments is to shape your mind. It is to direct your mind. The reason that this is what worship looks like and not this, the reason that you can eat these animals and not these, is that all of the commandments are supposed to shape and train your mind to have proper beliefs. And so he carries this over in the Mishnah Torah, even into the domain of battle. That if what you're trying to do is to root out unbelief, right, then there's a bigger window, a bigger latitude for war. And I've written that I think that Maimonides is affected here by that Almohad environment in Spain. As those folks come up from Morocco into Spain, as they take over Cordoba, he's exposed to a kind of a more rigorous defense of Islam, a more rigorous kind of rooting out of practices, a narrowing of the bands of what is acceptable. Because for much of Islamic history, right, there is an approach that Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians and even Hindus, right, fit under this rubric, the people of the book. And the people of the book are allowed to remain in the lands of Islam as long as they don't make too big of a deal
Mhm.
of their own religious practice. You can't ring bells in public. You can't have public funeral processions. You can't build new churches, but you're allowed to keep the churches that you have,
Right.
right? And so what all of that suggests is that for much of Islamic history, the door is open for Jews and Christians in Islamic lands. But the Almohads, it seems, at least the way that the previous generations of historians have told the story, they're kind of rooting that out in favor of a kind of more radical monotheism. His experience of the Almohads was scary. And as I said, his family moved out shortly thereafter. So I think the Islamic environment does have a kind of formative effect in how Maimonides thinks about the purpose of war.
Okay. So let's back up then to this question of purpose of war, and maybe we should talk a little bit more about his concept of the obligatory war. Right. You described
Yeah.
in terms of defense and defense of the territory.
Yeah.
Right. So could we unpack that a bit? What does per Maimonides is an obligatory war?
Right. So, as I said, there are, in Maimonides' code, right, there are a couple of different ideas, right? So, number one, the idea of rooting out Canaanites in the land of Israel, rooting out the Amalekites, right? These are, the kind of requirements of, for obligatory war, right?
Mhm.
But it also seems that a defensive war fits into that obligatory war.
In defense of the land,
Yeah,
based
absolutely. You
on
mean as
what?
opposed to the people,
Yeah, the people.
right?
I guess so. The people. So, but there are
The
specific
land, as
borders that you're
Maimonides
supposed to be
understands
defending.
it, right? So,
Okay.
as Maimonides understands it, and this is drawing on ancient ideas going back to some of our first rabbinic texts. The
Hmm.
land of Israel has a certain holiness to it,
Hmm.
right? And so, this is not all of what we see in the modern state of Israel, right? So, there were, when the state of Israel was founded, some radical voices who said, hey, the area on the east bank of the Jordan River in the Bible had been held by 2.5 tribes. We should
Hmm.
reconquer that, right? So
Right.
the state of Israel and the land of Israel don't perfectly overlap, right? Nor do they for Maimonides, right? Because in the medieval period, right, we don't have any of those, kind of modern boundaries between states, right? Lebanon, Syria, and the land of Israel were all called the same thing by Maimonides, Asham, which is, a name for Damascus and Syria as a whole. And that's because the north of the land of Israel and Lebanon and Syria itself are all kind of economically subordinate to Damascus, the big city there, just as the south of the land of Israel is really economically subordinate to Alexandria, to Egypt.
So one thing I do want to tease out, this question of is this all hypothetical
Right.
for Maimonides, and it occurred to me that like I can think of there's so very few examples of Jews taking up arms
Yeah.
since the last Roman revolt against the Romans. There are like a handful of examples I can think of where, in a very, very specific situation, the Jews of a certain community
Yep.
might have taken up arms alongside their neighbors
Mhm.
to defend against some attacker.
Well, not
Right?
only
In
that,
the
right?
in the
So,
medieval
yeah,
world, that
yep.
happened a few times. A few
For
times.
sure. For sure. Sources say that that Jews were assisting Islamic conquerors as they moved into Spain. Why? Because life for Jews under the Goths, the Visigoths who preceded Islamic conquest in Spain, was not good, right? To the extent that we know anything about it, it seems that Visigothic law was very negative on the Jews. And then, the opportunity to have all kinds of freedoms. Yes, limited freedoms, but a better
Relative.
environment,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Same thing on the other side of the Mediterranean, land of Israel, right? The land of Israel has been in conflict between the Byzantines and the Persians, right? But then Islam comes in, and yeah, Jews could live in Jerusalem when, the Byzantines hadn't let them do that,
Hmm.
right? So it may be that Jews actually had taken up arms in favor of their the Muslim conquerors.
Okay.
Sure. But that's not the same as taking up arms against their overlords, right?
Right. So it's not like there's no instance of any effort by Jewish communal leaders
Right.
to say, hey guys, let's take a moment, let's dust off our Maimonides
Right, right.
and think about the religious implications for or against getting involved in an armed conflict.
Right. So this is part of why the modern state of Israel, right, develops the idea of Torah Neshek, of kind of purity of arms, and they can appeal to Maimonides, they can appeal to the Bible, right?
Mhm.
But that idea is an expansion of some of those ideas, as opposed to a kind of restatement of those
Right.
of the material of Maimonides in the Bible. They
Right.
create it, right? And I would submit that that comes in part from the influence of Christian ideas of just war theory too, right? This is all in the mix of contemporary ideas of how to deal with the, non-combatants. Sure, you can go to the Bible, you can find some of it. You can go to the Mishnah Torah and find some of it. But, the idea to kind of restate that comes, with the founding of the state of Israel.
I guess what I'm trying to say is what I'm trying to get at is that Maimonides, right, created this theoretical construct.
Yeah,
Until the creation of the modern state of Israel, there's really no effort by anybody
right,
really to try to apply this theoretical construct to reality.
right.
And not only that, but I also believe, I mean, part of the reason why we're talking about Maimonides is I don't believe anybody else after Maimonides or before really has taken up the subject to the extent that Maimonides did. And I think in part because it was not relevant.
Mm. Right. So what he is doing in the Mishnah Torah is writing this kind of code for the ages, as I said, right?
Right,
So we have other codes
right,
before Maimonides, but those codes are seen as kind of digests of the Talmud, right? Or commentaries and so on, as opposed to, what he does, which, throws everything in the blender and, takes what comes out and sort of
right.
reorganizes it completely.
So, but I mean, one thing that means is I know that subsequent codes, you mentioned one, the Shulchan Aruch,
Yeah. Yeah.
quarrel with Maimonides about his understanding of, whether or not you drop some milk into a chicken soup,
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
But did he take up and have any sort of issues with his construct about just war theory?
Yeah,
I don't think so. It's
I
not to
don't
my
think so
knowledge,
either.
but
Right, right.
okay.
Because, right, Joseph Caro, also like Maimonides, born in Spain,
Hmm.
right? But his family makes his way shortly thereafter into to the land of Israel,
Hmm.
right? So Caro is hardly in a position, for his community to push back against, the kind of Spanish Empire that boots his family out of
Or,
Spain.
or even just the luxury of thinking about, I mean, Caro certainly wrote a lot about stuff that's not of concrete
Right,
reality.
that's true.
But the sort
Yeah,
of the I mean, it's almost like a luxury, maybe, to be thinking about just war theory
yeah. Right, right. But that's that's a great question, right? Why is it that Maimonides would then engage in this? And I have to think it comes out of his environment, right?
Okay.
Comes out of his own experience in this world where, warfare is just a way of life in Spain that is in conflict between Islam and Christianity. And then again, he goes from the frying pan into the fire, from
Mhm.
Cordoba eventually to Morocco, which is a place where, some scholars think that even he hid his own Judaism and practiced Islam,
Mhm.
right?
So point is, the environment is such that he is thinking about statecraft. He's thinking about war and peace. He's thinking about
Right. And when he moves
international
on,
relations, as it were.
right, and on the other side of the Mediterranean, right?
Mhm.
It's the Crusades.
Backing up again. So the obligatory war is ultimately a war of the land of defense. You're defending the land of Israel as they understood it at the time. Uh, there is this notion that the optional war might be
Yeah.
wholly legitimate, but you sort of have to pass a War Powers Act.
I
Uh,
like thinking about it that way.
right.
Yeah.
It's a War Powers Act from the Sanhedrin. So this should not be just your whim or something that you feel is useful for your own political thing. There needs to be a real logic to it that the Sanhedrin's going to sign off on. Are there any implications with respect to the conduct of the war?
So Maimonides himself, eschews the idea that these biblical and Talmudic sort of no holds barred destruction, that can follow a successful siege, right? He sort of holds back on that, right? So the prohibition of destroying a vanquished enemy's fruit-bearing trees, right, is enlarged to say any form of ransacking with destructive intent, right? All fits under the rubric of the commandment, don't destroy, right?
Mhm.
So he expands that to say that, all right, according to the Bible, right, you can't destroy fruit bearing trees. We're not going to allow you to in the obligatory war in that siege, you can't destroy anything.
What does that mean? I mean, does this concern for the solicitude for fruit bearing trees, does that
Yeah.
ever extend to people?
I mean, the enemy is the enemy, and the Bible itself gives, as I said, kind of regulations about how you treat female captives and
Mhm.
so on. The division between combatants and non-combatants is not really there because everyone is taking up arms, right? And when you are besieging a city, right, everyone is involved in combat, right? And so, I think that distinction isn't there, and so he doesn't really have to make it. Does contemporary Israel make that distinction? For sure. When not everybody is of the age of military service. Not everybody is doing reserve duty right now. I think there's a ceiling of like 42 or something like that, after which you're done
Mhm.
with your reserve duty. Some people, even after that, want to keep doing it and they can. But this probably draws on biblical ideas that priests were like a certain band of age, and after that, like you weren't carrying
Right.
the accoutrement of the temple, let alone carrying arms. But this probably carries over to how Israel prosecutes war, right? That they may be more willing to see, enemy non-combatants as potential combatants, because that kind of radical distinction that we make in the West between non-combatants and combatants, it may not be there in the Bible.
Yeah, except that, as we were saying, it's very debatable, like how much influence
Right. How much
any
does the
Jewish
Bible have?
culture have
Right.
or in the
Right.
Bible have on
Right.
contemporary
But
Israeli society? It's
contemporary
debatable.
ethicists, contemporary Jewish ethicists are going to say, oh, we're looking to the Bible for this.
Mhm.
Right. And so they can find something to hold on to.
They can. I just don't
Yeah.
know, your average person, it's
Right. Right. So that's why, as a society, modern Israel creates the idea of Tohar and Neshek to say, all right, this is what our ethics are around battle.
Mhm.
We're going to try to be super moral and pure. But you're right. They're not citing chapter and verse of the Bible, but they might find some inspiration from it.
Right. And they're not citing Maimonides.
No,
I've
no.
never heard that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Anything to add?
The Mishnah Torah is very approachable. And so for that reason, and it's widely available in translation. So I
Mhm.
would encourage folks to, read the material, the chapters on the wars of the laws of kings and their wars. All right, so if you're interested in reading more about these specific topics about Milchemet Rashut, kind of discretionary war, Milchemet Mitzvah, an obligatory war, or Maimonides himself, right? You can read the articles that I wrote in the Encyclopedia of War and Religion, edited um, by Jeffrey Shaw and Timothy Demi.
Excellent. Thank you. I, of course, will put a link to that book in the description, just as I'm putting a link to this new book that just came out, um, this monumental translation of the Guide to the Perplexed. I
Thank
gotta
you.
say, in case you're not familiar with this, but the Guide to the Perplexed, like translating this is no easy task because you can't do it unless you really know your medieval Islamic literature, your medieval Islamic, yeah, Arabic. I mean, you've got to know a lot to take a run, make a run at this.
I listen,
Otherwise,
I was
it's just
fortunate to team
impossible.
with a philosopher who knew the philosophical material, Greek, Islamic, and Jewish inside and out, Len Goodman. So it was great working with him and having that world opened up to me because as someone who works in Jewish and Islamic law, right, and Jewish and Islamic culture, right, that was the lens that I brought. And together, I hope we produce something that people can read and get something out of.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for doing this, please,
It was
and thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me.
No, it was my pleasure. Hoping to do this again sometime.
Likewise. So if
Awesome.
y'all like this video, please like and subscribe, of course, and I'll see you in the next video.